Almost every year of elementary school, I missed Halloween because of a new illness. I would dress up in my costume, and since I couldn't touch the candy to hand it out, I had to sit on my front steps next to the bowl of candy and watch other kids take it. When I was in the 4th grade, I wanted to go out as Wonder Woman, but I caught the swine flu. I spent my Halloween night with my grandmother, unable to actually touch the candy, so I made a cup of noodles and passed out on my couch, still in costume. Just imagine how pathetic a 9-year-old Wonder Woman looked sleeping on the couch on Halloween night with just a cup of soup. Another year, I caught pneumonia, and it was extremely hard for me to breathe. It was also too cold for me to be outside for a long period of time, so I spent Halloween watching trick-or-treaters from my window, wishing I could be them. Staying healthy was never really my thing. I would often come home with some new illness, ranging from the flu, common cold, strep throat, ear, and sinus infections, and probably whatever else was going around school at the time. In February of 2014, I was in the middle of my club field hockey season. I was training for the USA Field Hockey National Tournament with my club team, which met on Sunday mornings at Governor's Academy. One morning, I woke up with terrible stomach pain. I was feeling sluggish and extremely queasy, but I motivated myself to get dressed and ready for practice. I packed my bag, loaded the car, and set out for Govs. Once we got there, I got fully dressed and walked up to the middle basketball court and began to stretch. The immediate moment that I began stretching was when it all began. I felt a pop in my lower right side and then immediate burning. It felt like a wildfire swept up the right side of my torso. A few seconds of this passed, and then I felt the nausea. I sat on the bench in the gym with cramping in my side and told my mom the symptoms I was experiencing. With her knowledge in medicine, she knew immediately that I was having an appendicitis. My parents drove me to the urgent care center in North Andover, and with my luck, the line was out of the door. My mom told the nurse my symptoms, and we were advised that we were better off going into Boston. I remember staring up at the ceiling of my car, feeling the bumps of the highway on my back, and thinking of all the things that could happen. Once we arrived at the hospital, I was escorted through the hallways and past stretchers with children headed to surgery. After a long day of tests, I was carted off to pre-op, and the anesthesiologist pumped me full of laughing gas. The room began to spin, and my head began to feel light. The last thing I remember was the feeling of the mask being placed on my face. I woke up a few hours later, alone in the recovery room. There were no nurses, the lighting was dim, and it was something out of a horror movie. I found no other patients in the room. I went back under another wave of anesthesia and woke up to a high-pitched dinging sound. I opened my eyes and saw the white back of the iPhone and my mom's frantic fingers dancing across the screen, desperately trying to beat her high score on Candy Crush. I remembered the mixture of immediate joy and relaxation that I felt in that moment. Now that she was here, nothing else could go wrong. After my surgery, I was advised to take 1 week off from any physical activity. I took 2 days off, and I played at nationals at the end of the week. The summer before my junior year was one for the books. I was having a successful club lacrosse season and overall a pretty good summer. But it wasn't until mid-July that my luck began to turn around. After a club tournament, my coach told me that the Albany assistants expressed their interest in me to her. At first, I didn't think much of it. But after talking with my parents, I was signed up for the summer camp within minutes and already drafting an email to the assistant coaches thanking them for their interest. My first day at Albany was rough. I was staying in the dorm with commits and grades above me, and I was also the only one not from New York. However, it was the best level of cross that I had ever been a part of. But I couldn't wait to go home. The next day of camp crawled by. When it did end, I tried to leave as quickly as possible, eager to begin my 3-hour car ride back home. I was caught by the head coach, and he told my dad that he liked the way that I played and he was willing to offer me a scholarship if I would come. I was taken by surprise because I had struggled through some of the drills, I was super out of my comfort zone, and I was very overwhelmed. I felt reluctant. I wasn't sure that this was the place for me. I thanked him for the offer, but I informed him that I needed some time to decide. He gave me a deadline, and by then I needed to have a decision for him. But before I could do that, all hell broke loose. I began to have fevers, chills, and body aches. Watching TV or even trying to have a simple conversation would cause my head to pound. A few days of laying in bed seemed to do the trick because I found myself packing up my lacrosse bag and getting into the Vermont Mountain car. My club team goes to Stowe every year to finish our season. As sick as I felt, I was excited to be there and spend one last weekend with my team. Eventually, I returned back to my hotel room. I was laying on my stomach on one of the hotel beds when my mom came into the room. She noticed something on the back of my leg and she asked me what it was. At first, I was confused, and even when I turned my head to try and see what she was talking about, I couldn't see it. On the back of my leg was a bullseye. At first, I didn't know what that meant because I never had a bullseye before, but then my mom explained to me that it comes from a tick bite. My mom then told me that she would take me to the urgent care center in the morning to get seen by a doctor. I went to sleep that night finally having an idea as to what was wrong with me, which provided me with some relief. I did not wake up that morning feeling relief. I opened my eyes and I instantly felt dizzy. I tried to turn my head to the alarm clock, but I couldn't move my neck. I manually picked up my head and sat up, and the nausea began. The rest of that morning is a blur, but I remember sitting in the waiting room vividly. I had to wear sunglasses because the lights made my head pound. I asked for the removal of the wall clock because the ticking was hurting my head, and all I wanted to do was sleep. The doctor gave me one look and confirmed that I had Lyme disease and also that I had aseptic meningitis. My mom made the ultimate decision to drive me home into the hospital, which crushed my hopes of playing in the tournament. So we began our 3-hour car ride back home. I slept most of the way home because it was much easier than being awake to experience my symptoms. We finally reached the emergency room where I was escorted in through the back and immediately in the presence of a doctor who delivered some bad news. He said the only way to test for meningitis is through a spinal tap. I had a pretty good idea of what that would entail, and I wasn't excited. For those of you who don't know, a spinal tap is when they take a needle about this big and they insert it between 2 bones in your lower back to take a sample of spinal fluid and they test it. So the Novocaine went first, which burned, and then the real deal began. The procedure didn't last long, and when it ended, I was advised to lay flat because my back would be sore. The test came back negative a few hours later. I was told to keep taking my meds for the Lyme disease, and eventually my symptoms of meningitis would go away. However, because I had the spinal tap, I could develop spinal headaches. Although I was in the age group of developing them, the doctor advised that I take a few days off and rest my back, so that was my plan. Rest for a few days, and then get ready to leave for Brine Nationals, which were in the middle of that week. I was discharged from the hospital on Sunday night. On Monday morning, things were starting to look up until that afternoon when I got my first headache. I told my mom, who must have realized that this cycle would never end, and she recited what the doctor said if I ever had one. The only immediate cure to a spinal headache was laying down completely flat. So that's how I spent my Monday. I laid flat until we reached Beverly Hospital, and I put on the performance of my life. Although my brain felt like it was being crushed, I knew that I needed to get cleared to play in this tournament, and spinal headaches shouldn't last for that long. I was in the midst of laying on my couch, hoping that my headache would go away, when I remembered that I was supposed to call the Albany coach. I realized that I didn't have a decision for him yet. I sent him an email apologizing, asking for a few more days, and explaining that I was very sick. Finally, Wednesday rolled around, and it was time to leave for Brine. The headaches had gotten worse with each passing day, but I still had hopes of playing in this tournament. So we drove 12 hours to Richmond, Virginia, with me laying completely flat in the backseat of the car. We were there for 2 days, and during that whole duration, I got out of bed twice. One morning, I was woken up by my dad and reminded that I needed to call the Albany coach. At this moment in time, I was very prepared to say no. I called the coach, and he gave me another extension. I knew that I had a lot of thinking to do, but getting better was at the top of my list. The Brine tournament was scheduled to begin on Saturday, and by Friday morning, my mom began to assess my current state. She pulled the plug on my tournament dreams, and before I knew it, I was back in the car driving 12 hours home. This car ride home would prove to change my life. Although I was laying in the back seat, I was able to talk with my parents about Albany. It had always been my dream to play Division I lacrosse, but because of my experience at the summer camp, I was ready to shut it down. My mom pulled up Albany's schedule on her phone and read me the names of the teams. These were the teams that I had always dreamed of playing for, but I never had the opportunity. So, to this day, I hold this quote dear to my heart: if you can't join them, beat them. I thought that that was amazing, just to have the opportunity to play against these teams. My mom took me back to the hospital to get an epidural blood patch put into my spine to stop the spinal headaches. Blood was taken out of my arm and injected into my spine, and I had to lay completely flat for 30 minutes after that, and then every 15 minutes I was elevated a few inches. My headache was gone, but my back was stiff and sore. A few days after, I called the Albany coach and I committed. I was on bed rest for a month, which was the longest month of my life, but my childhood dream finally came true. I was raised to be an athlete. Growing up, I always had something to do. It ranged from ballet to figure skating to t-ball to soccer, and they all eventually turned into field hockey, ice hockey, and lacrosse, and I never looked back. I fell in love with each game. Because of this passion and drive to always be better than how I last was, sports became my life. I think that this is the case for a lot of people too. It doesn't necessarily have to be sports, but we all have that one thing that we have sacrificed so much for, practice habitually, and just love doing. And if you haven't found that special something, I promise you that you will. For me, it's lacrosse. And before you think to yourself, oh, we get it, you're committed, just hear me out. Although I was incredibly sick, I was given time to think about Albany. If I wasn't given that extra time, I probably would have said no. What I'm advising you to just consider is to treat all things with the same amount of respect. Don't overlook things because they might just turn out to be the best things that ever happened to you. This can also apply to people in your lives or important life decisions or whatever it may be. Life is full of unexpected relationships and experiences, but what matters is how you react to adversity, which will ultimately define you as the person you are. How you learn to adapt as life hits you with everything it's got will allow you to understand the people around you, but more importantly, it helps you understand yourself, your real self. Thank you.